Welcome to this edition of Excavating the Bible, a program dedicated to exploring the contributions of archaeologists who work in the Middle East to our understanding of and appreciation for the Bible. I'm Doug Clark. I direct the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology at La Sierra University in Riverside, California, and I'm joined by a group of scholars who love the Bible and love archaeology, and we're helping you, Kendra, to love archaeology more. So Dr. Larry Geraty, who is co-host of this program, and an associate director of the center, former president of the university. Dr. Kendra Holoviak-Valentine, who is a professor of New Testament studies, also at La Sierra, and actually carrying an administrative role right now as well in general studies, dean of the School of General Studies. And Dr. Kent Bramlett, who is an associate professor of archaeology and the history of antiquity, also at La Sierra. We have been talking about the Gospels in our progression through the Bible, book by book. We're doing it kind of section of the Gospels by section of the Gospels now. And we turn our attention this time, and in the next episode, to the Galilee, to the region of the Galilee, and Jesus' ministry in the Galilee. I want to try to think about archaeological connections that might help set the stage, might help us understand some of the gospel stories better that happen there. When I say the Galilee, how does that resonate with you? Is that something that resonates? Jesus was really busy there, doing lots of things. Is that something that's positive as you think about reading the Gospels?
You know, when I hear Galilee, it conjures up in my mind all the stories, the hymns, you know, the music that's associated with Galilee, the home of Jesus, and it gives me a kind of a warm feeling. So Galilee is a very positive thing. But I also know that from the standpoint of Jerusalemites, Galilee was not that well thought of. You know, there were a lot of renegade Jews up there that were always causing a lot of trouble to the Roman Empire and so on. So it was more wild and woolly, I think, than the urbanites believed in. But so there is a contrast there.
For you.
Yeah.
Either of you.
One scholar called it the 60s Berkeley.
Okay.
And what that might mean for the connotation of thinking about. But my reaction when I hear the word Galilee is also instantly kind of peaceful.
Yeah.
I remember the first time I went out on a boat on the Galilee. It was just the perfect day, calm, and just you have the sense of, you know, this is that space, this is that place where Jesus lived and walked around, and I just had this sense of awe, very moving, actually, a very moving experience. But then I think of what that region was at the time the Gospels were being written, and how that was a place of much pain and war, and so it's a mixture of feelings, isn't it?
Yeah.
Kent.
Well, I have some of the same feelings of the bucolic, sort of northern, greener settings than many other places in Israel. And having spent a year in Nazareth, I can't really separate it now from my experiences there. But I feel that you're somehow closer to many of the biblical stories there. There hasn't been as much change, at least around the Sea of Galilee, as areas like Jerusalem, which are completely transformed by modernity.
Positive, at least some positive for all of you, and some questions that you might ask. You think about, as you mentioned, Kendra, the turmoil, maybe the calming of the sea meant more than we think of it just by reading the story from our perspective. Maybe there was something more significant there.
There's also been some discussion of how the Sea of Galilee was actually a barrier between different ethnic groups. And in, for example, the Gospel of Mark, Jesus keeps crossing the Sea of Galilee, almost like a way of saying he's interacting purposefully with people of various backgrounds and traditions around that sea.
Well, for this episode of Excavating the Bible, we're staying on the western side, but we will get to the eastern. We'll get there. We'll get to the eastern side. A few artifacts in front of us. Kent, talk to us just a bit. We'll not take a long time with these artifacts, but explain what we have.
Well, throughout the Roman Empire, there was a fairly uniform set of utensils and pottery vessels. But it's not to say that everybody had exactly the same thing. The terra sigillata, this really fine, thin Roman pottery type, they can make bowls out of it, others, was the standard. Everybody wanted the terra sigillata if you were anybody. This is not terra sigillata, but it's a local imitation. They're trying to produce something like it, but it doesn't have the fineness of the real thing. So probably if you couldn't afford it, you attempted to emulate it as closely as possible. With a knockoff, exactly. And we have other vessels here that are, again, typical of that time period, as well as daily life artifacts here. These are real spindle whorls that have been found in the archaeological context. These are very thin ones, again, a weight for spinning flax, the small ones. The heavier ones would be for spinning wool into yarn. Again, part of the process of making textiles to clothe the family.
And then we have a few lamps, it looks like, all from this time period, call them Herodian. Because
right, especially common around Jerusalem, but they appealed to the Jewish sensibilities. They didn't have the typical Roman pagan motifs on them.
And I think, Larry, some glass.
Right, that's sort of a step up from the ceramic vessels if you were to purchase them, because they're harder to make and a little more rare. Though in Roman strata, we usually do find broken glass along with broken pottery and bones and so on. It's ubiquitous.
Right.
Yeah.
And then we have a number of ceramic vessels, many of them characterized by this ribbing. And I think, Kent, as the typologist at our dig and those who've preceded you, ribbing signals something, at least classical
age.
Right. And then you look at other things to indicate more precisely the time. But these would probably be quite at home in any home in the Galilee. Now, these are mostly from the Jerusalem area, but would there be a lot of difference?
Not at this time. I mean, there was earlier in the Old Testament period, we had styles that we can identify as northern or southern Israel. But now, again, because of that larger Roman cultural influence, there's largely one style that extends across the Roman Empire.
Kind of a result of what we've called the Pax Romana, this peace over the entire Mediterranean world.
So if Jesus walked into his kitchen, he would not be surprised to see any of these things here.
Not by any of them. Okay, then let's look at some illustrations, some slides, and think about this part of the Gospels. And Kendra, we'll look to you in a moment to think about the Gospels and Galilee, how they connect. But before we get there, we archaeologists at least like to orient ourselves and put ourselves in context. Kent, the context here.
Well, we are dealing with Herod the Great and his descendants, the three sons who were contemporary rulers for as long as they ruled, and then Agrippa II, who was actually a grandson of Herod through one of his sons that he executed.
Kendra, why do we put Agrippa II here? Why do we have that time period now spread apart away from the life of Jesus? Why is that here?
Because whenever we think of the world behind the texts, we're actually talking about two different worlds behind. The world in which we see these actions taking place, the stories around Jesus, but then we also have the time in which the Gospels are being written. So it's really kind of constantly thinking about those two locations, what was going on in the Galilee at the time of Jesus, what was going on in the Galilee at the time that the Gospels are being written.
And different communities from this time, from the later time period here, to which the Gospel writers were communicating, and with which message would mean something.
Precisely.
Would communicate.
I might add, Agrippa II, when he was young, he actually lived in Tiberias for a while by the Sea of Galilee. When he had to leave Rome, he got in debt. He was hanging out with the Tiberius, the emperor's son, who later died, and then suddenly his debts came due, so he had to escape. And his uncle put him up there in Tiberias for a while.
Okay, good connection, good connection. We also like to orient ourselves geopolitically, and in this map, which we have seen before because it so well illustrates some territories. What territories are here, Larry?
Well, in the south there, you have Judea. In the very south, as part of that, is Idumea, where Herod had
Actually
his
comes from.
background. That's right. And as you move north, Samaria, you see, separates Judea from Galilee. And if you didn't want to go through Samaria, your only choice was to cross the Jordan River and go up through Perea and the Decapolis area to get to Galilee.
And this happens sometimes
It
in the
did.
gospel stories.
Right.
Right. Okay, 4 gospels. Well, we've talked about other gospels too, but 4 gospels in the canonical New Testament. Kendra, how do these books relate to Galilee?
Well, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus spends the majority of his time in the region of the Galilee. He will make one trip to Jerusalem, and of course, it is in that one trip that he will be arrested and eventually crucified after less than a week. In the Gospel of John, Jesus will go to Jerusalem 3 times. So there's a lot more going back and forth between the 2 areas. But in the Synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, much of Jesus' ministry will be located up near the Sea of Galilee, especially on the east side, but occasionally, mostly on the
West
west
side,
side,
right,
and
right.
then occasionally on the east.
Now, is there a larger percentage of John dedicated to Jerusalem than we would see in the Synoptic Gospels?
I would say yes, but we always need to remember that 20% of each of the Gospels is the last week of Jesus'
Well,
life.
that's true.
So it's always going to be a significant part in Jerusalem.
Right.
But for John, there are more trips there,
Right. Okay.
more events happening in Judea.
Okay. So when we talk about archaeology and the Gospels, as we think about what we can learn from archaeology, a number of questions arise. We talked a little bit, Kent, about the differences, and in evidently the cultural remains, not a lot of differences because of this Roman umbrella. And even the local traditions in Galilee. I mean, this bowl that we have, which is a knockoff, is from the Jerusalem area. Would we have the same phenomenon in the Galilee?
I would imagine so. There's probably less of the real Roman finer ware at this time period. It increases in the 2nd century,
Okay.
but after the time of Jesus.
Okay. And then, of course, daily life, survival. How did people live? What did they eat? How did they worship? What did they wear? So those sorts of issues, which, as we have talked about actually on several episodes, is kind of a subdiscipline of archaeology because we've been kind of, for decades, we've thought about these larger kind of empire moves. We've talked about these major events. We find these destruction layers, and we think about the major transitions between occupants who have lived there. Daily life was kind of neglected for a while, but now it is here, and that's where most people survive. That's where most people were. So that's probably a good reason for moving in that
And
direction.
archaeology has developed many more techniques to achieve
Right.
results about daily life.
Extract that information.
Extract that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And of course, we think about socioeconomic and religion as well. We could put, we could talk about a lot of inscriptions in the Galilee. I'm only going to put 2 here that have been discovered recently. I'm not sure what they say, but I do know that as archaeologists continue working, they keep finding inscriptions. How exciting is it, Kent, to find an inscription?
Oh, it's fantastic. We dream of that at nighttime. The inscriptions can tell us a lot. Connecting script or text with archaeology is something you can do in the Middle East because of that rich textual history. Many parts of the world, we don't have a written history to do that. So it's something that we really do appreciate, and it adds a whole new dimension.
So just a couple of them, and again, I don't know anything about them, but they have recently been excavated in Tiberias. You mentioned Tiberias a minute ago.
So Aramaic would have been the common language spoken in
Good
Jesus'
point.
time.
And how many languages do we need to be thinking about here? Well, at least Aramaic, and also from Tiberias, Greek. What else might we think about for?
Well, Hebrew, of course, was the language of religion, but Latin was the language of the overlords. So at least 4 different languages were very common.
And the more educated probably would have some kind of handle
Right.
on those languages. Well, then let's think about some discoveries. Some of them have been around for a while, but they are in my mind, so connected to the biblical stories, like the Galilee boat. And we'll walk through these that are listed here. I like this map because it has for us the western side. You just kind of think left, think west, and several of these places we'll visit in the slides for this particular episode. And we'll do so by starting with the Galilee boat. Kent, you spent a lot of time in the Galilee, but had it been found? It was 86 when it was found.
Right, 86. I was there in 92.
Right.
It had been found. They were still trying to preserve it to prevent it from degrading further. After all, the wood was quite soft. But yeah, actually with a friend, he used to take me to Kibbutz Ginnisar where it was found, and he would go fishing there. So many times in the evening, we went to this location. There's the boat right inside the building.
And the wood was sort of the consistency of wet cardboard. So excavating this was not just finding these beams or these parts of the boat. It was finding wet cardboard, which, well, I mean, the story of its excavation is quite remarkable, too.
There were at least, I think, a dozen different kinds of wood, too, that was used in making this boat.
And techniques that suggested it was first century.
Right.
So the kind of boat we can think about that the disciples would have used.
And the pottery that was found with it, a couple of cooking pots and lamps, are the very same as the first century layers at several of the sites around, including Magdala.
So why would the cooking pots be in boats?
Well, that's an interesting question. But I mean, certainly if they're going across the sea, they'd want to take
lunch.
their lunch with them, or the ability to make
So this
lunch.
has already been cooked, and they're keeping it in the pot as they go across the sea.
I mean, it's conceivable that Jesus could have been in that boat. Obviously, we don't know, but it comes from a time when he could have been that.
And it fits well the style.
That's right.
And we'll look at some other illustrations, which I think will certainly add to that picture. A late 19th century photo here, which has been colorized, but it's a nice image of fisher people on the Sea of Galilee, and that takes us then to communities along the Sea of Galilee. Kendra, you've thought about these locations, and you visited here. Capernaum, what does that mean in terms of Jesus' ministry on the western side of the Galilee?
Such a significant location for so many reasons, one of which is the Gospel of Mark hints that this is actually the headquarters of Jesus' ministry. So when you're looking at this particular excavation site, you're looking at a place where the gospel begins in many ways.
Jesus loved to come here, didn't he?
Yes, and sort of like a second home. You get the idea that once he has launched his ministry, that really this is his home more than Nazareth. So to kind of think about that and think of the community that is part of this particular location near the sea, and where Jesus would kind of go after preaching, after teaching, after healing. That he would go there with his disciples, Mark tells us, and go into an inner room of the house there and explain further what he'd been saying to the large crowds along the sea, and explain it further for the sake of the disciples' better understanding.
I have wondered if one is really, when you do visit, getting the full sense of a fishing village, though. We don't typically add the smell or the smells, but wouldn't this be kind of interesting? Okay, interesting may not be the word that works here, but...
Well, and the activity and the busyness
Sure.
and what people would be doing. True, that's a good point.
Right. A nice rendition here of what Capernaum might have looked like. And of course here the fishing stands out. You've got the piers and so on. And then, and we'll actually look at some of these buildings as archaeologists found them. Kent, tell us about this particular rendition.
Well, this is an artist's reconstruction based on the wall lines of what may actually be Peter's house. There are lines of evidence which I find rather convincing that this is. So it's a typical fisherman's courtyard house from the first century. And you can see then you go in through a doorway, and then you're in a courtyard, and there's different buildings within that structure. So the inner room would probably be sort of the main living quarters.
The left center
The
part
left center
here
part.
that we're primarily thinking about.
Yeah.
We will get at some of the archaeological remains, and this is kind of the famous octagonal set of concentric octagonal walls. What's represented here?
Well, there's the central area preserves that room where you just mentioned, where it would be the center of the house, and probably a house church continued to meet there regularly. But in the 4th and the 5th centuries, the building was expanded, and while preserving the original architecture, they created these octagonal walls around it to provide more of a formal structure. So clearly, the desire to preserve the original while creating a sacred space around
And I
it.
think there was graffiti on the walls that indicated
several
that it
languages,
was
yeah.
worship.
Aramaic,
Yeah.
particularly.
Well, then let's see what happens when you want to preserve the site in a different way. What's happening here? Larry, you take guests, lots of guests there.
The Roman Catholic Church has built that, looks like a flying saucer over the house of Peter, which for many of us, it sort of spoils the look, but it does preserve what's underneath it, presumably.
Okay. So we're going to go underneath it then to this particular plan. And Kent, you were talking about the house. Just verbally, help us think about what this is.
Well, it's actually sort of the earliest, and then you also have this later wall. The big rectangle around the outside is later to create a sacred precinct. But the stone walls that you see outlined inside are centered on that main room where probably in the gospel we can identify with the gospel story where Jesus heals Peter's mother. And so there's that special story that's connected with Peter's house. And village tradition would remember, who lived where for several generations, and then by the time Christianity is formalized and they want to maintain that tradition, it's still known.
So
People could point it out.
You're pretty persuaded?
I am quite persuaded.
Yeah. Kendra, you visited there. Did that make sense to you to lock it into the story and at least some good reason to think that this is a place where Peter would have lived?
It did. I had not done as much study of Mark's gospel when I had gone there as I have now, but I'm really looking forward to going back with that set of eyeglasses. Right. And it also makes the story come alive that Jesus going into the room to heal Peter's mother-in-law would be a conscious act. It's not that there's just a one room and she's right there on the side of the room, but that he's going into a separate area. Is a fascinating detail to the story.
Right.
Makes it more real.
Another thing now available to see in the courtyard of Capernaum is this stone carved with an image of what?
Yeah, the Ark of the Covenant.
Right.
Yeah,
On its cart.
on its cart.
So we have the chariot here.
I think it comes from the Byzantine period, but it's a artist's rendition anyway.
Right. Typical of the Galilee, the black basalt stone, but what would this be used for?
Milling.
Milling. Would this provide the real life illustration for tying somebody's neck with a millstone around it and throwing them into the sea? Would that connect fairly quickly and easily?
It would, yeah.
And not much escape?
No. And the sea was not very far away.
And the sea was not
Yeah,
far
that's
away.
true.
Another site that, I think it had been excavated earlier, but recently there is new archaeological activity.
Just within the last 3 or 4 years, yeah.
So Kent, what is this?
Well, this is part of the village of Magdala. And of course, Mary Magdalene comes from Magdala. It actually comes from the name of a tower, and this is where they made fish sauce, garum, very popular in the Roman world.
Right.
But we're looking here at, in the left there, at a synagogue that was excavated. And it was very special because they found an altar.
From a different orientation.
Okay, so now we're
There it
looking
is
down
again.
on the top. There it is again. And the iconography that was on this
The
carved,
next slide, I think.
in the next slide, was on the carved altar stone. Again, not a sacrificial altar, but probably for the ark, for the storage of the scrolls. Has some very fascinating symbols on it.
So is it
And the
a
symbols
menorah?
are done on each side, so all 4
4 sides.
sides are significant, yeah.
So Magdala is even growing in importance to visit and to see. Oh, and the ship mosaic.
Right, that's famous because it helped us understand the Galilee boat, which we saw earlier. We can understand how it was crewed, probably 5 people. One of those oars is actually the steering, the quarter rudder, and so you'd have double the lead oars and then the person running the rudder.
Rudder in the back. Cana, does that sound familiar from one of the Bible stories? Sure.
First miracle.
The first miracle. And now, how far is this from the town of Cana?
The Khirbet Cana is north. Kafr Cana, the village of Cana, is just on a couple miles to the east. So there's 2 candidates for the village of Cana where Jesus performed the miracle.
So that has not been settled.
No.
The debate has not been settled. Okay.
Not entirely.
We'll keep looking to
Even
archaeologists to
within
help us.
Kafr there are 2 candidates,
Well,
aren't there?
the Catholic Church and the
Right,
Rome, yeah,
right.
exactly.
So, Kent, you spent some time in Nazareth.
Yep, I lived in Nazareth
What
for
is this?
a year. Well, this was the old fountain. There's a spring that's now underneath the Greek Orthodox Church. When the water was piped out and provided water at this public fountain for the old village, the Ottoman period village. When they widened the road, they had to move it. So if you go to Nazareth today, there is still a fountain there, but it's a more modern one and shifted over.
It's funny that the tour guides don't really talk about that shift.
No, they don't bother with that part.
A Roman, well, at least the foundations for one Roman house. And I think you've talked, Kent, about this being between a couple of other Roman.
Right, there are actually 2 other buildings which date back to the 1st century. And by tradition, one of them was the house that Mary grew up in, and then one of them was the house where she raised Jesus with Joseph.
Hard to know how to go with those, but at least it gives a feel.
For a long time, we didn't have any actual ruins or remains from the time of Jesus, but now we do.
But now we do. Even caves like this from occupied during the Roman period, and a special tomb, a rolling stone tomb in Nazareth, also Roman. And then Kent, I think when you were there, they were just beginning to put together what came to be known as the Nazareth village.
Right. It was an attempt to bring more tourism there, but it's very well done. It represents authentic 1st century construction, and they have workshops where they show other activities.
That's right. In fact, let's look at
typical.
a couple of illustrations of that.
Sure.
This, I guess, is just on the edge of the village.
Right,
And
and you
then
walk through pathways through the village.
Correct. And then one gets to
Carpenter
a
shop.
carpenter shop. Not too bad. That's pretty
They've
good.
trained local people to act out the part of.
Right. I mean, what a great way to
Illustrate
do a
life.
period illustration and what was going on. Right. And then, of course, Sepphoris, which is not a city mentioned in the New Testament, but wasn't far from Nazareth, just a few miles. We assume Jesus got there a time or 2. Thank you, Larry, Kendra, and Kent, and all of you for joining us for this edition of Excavating the Bible. We hope we've provided something for you to think about and to increase your faith, and we look forward to next time. Until then, think ancient, keep believing, and keep exploring.